I never thought I'd be the type of girl to fall for my professor. Back home in Minnesota, we didn't have stories like this. Life was simpler there, more black and white. Right and wrong were as clear as the line between cornfields and sky. But here at Preston University, everything exists in shades of gray. Including Dr. Thomas Bennett. I remember the first day I walked into his Literature of the Romantic Period class. The lecture hall was different from the others, smaller, more intimate. Dark wood panels lined the walls, and morning light filtered through tall windows. It felt more like a private library than a classroom. I chose a seat in the middle row, not too eager, not too distant. That's when he walked in. Dr. Bennett didn't just enter the room, he commanded it. Tall, distinguished, with silver hair and sharp gray eyes. He wore a perfectly tailored navy suit that probably cost more than my entire wardrobe. When he spoke, every head in the room lifted. Every pen stopped scratching. Every breath seemed to pause. Poetry, he said, his voice deep and rich, is not about words on a page. It's about the spaces between those words. The things we can't say, but desperately need to express. I was captivated from that first sentence. It wasn't just what he said, but how he said it. Like each word carried the weight of centuries. Like he was sharing secrets instead of teaching a class. I should have known then that I was in trouble. But I was too busy trying to survive. My scholarship covered tuition, but barely. Every month was a struggle to make rent on my tiny apartment. My dad had lost his job at the factory back home. Mom was working double shifts at the diner. They couldn't help, and I wouldn't ask. I was their dream, the first Parker to go to college. I couldn't let them down. So I worked part-time at the campus coffee shop. Lived on ramen noodles and free coffee. Watched my wealthy classmates carry their designer bags. Pretended not to notice the difference. Dr. Bennett's class became my escape. For those 90 minutes, 3 times a week, I could forget about my empty bank account. Forget about the mounting pressure. Lose myself in Wordsworth and Shelley. In his voice, bringing the words to life. I started staying after class. Just a few minutes at first. Questions about the reading, clarification on assignments. He always had time, always seemed pleased to explain. His office hours became my sanctuary. Books lined every wall, floor to ceiling. The leather chair across from his desk became my confessional. You have a unique perspective, Ellie, he'd say. You see things others miss. No one had ever talked to me like that before. Like I had something valuable to contribute. Like I wasn't just another scholarship kid trying to fit in. Then midterms hit, and everything started to unravel. My other classes were slipping. Too many late shifts at the coffee shop. Too many nights spent staring at my bank balance. Wondering how I'd make it through another month. The essay for his class was due, and I wasn't ready. I'd tried to write it between shifts. Between panic attacks about my dwindling savings. Between calls from Mom, trying to sound cheerful. What I turned in was garbage, and I knew it. But when the grades came back, I stared in disbelief. A perfect score. Higher than I'd ever earned before. Higher than I deserved. I knew what it meant. Knew he was doing me a favor. The question was why. I had to know. That afternoon, I knocked on his office door. My heart hammering against my ribs. Come in, Ellie, he called. He was grading papers, reading glasses perched on his nose. Looking every bit the distinguished professor. I wanted to thank you, I said softly. for the grade. He looked up, those gray eyes meeting mine. You earned it. But we both knew that wasn't true. No, I said. I didn't. But I appreciate it more than you know. Something shifted in the air between us. A current I couldn't name but could definitely feel. Sit down, Ellie, he said. And I did, like I always did. But this time felt different. This time felt dangerous. Tell me what's troubling you, he said. His voice gentle, concerned. And maybe it was the stress. Maybe it was desperation. Maybe it was the way he looked at me. But I told him everything. About my dad losing his job. About working endless coffee shop shifts. About feeling like I was drowning. He listened without interrupting. Those eyes never leaving my face. When I finished, the silence stretched between us. Heavy with possibility. What are you asking me for, Ellie? His voice was different now. Lower, more intimate. I swallowed hard, gathering my courage. I need help, I whispered. I'll do anything to stay in school. Anything? The word hung in the air like smoke. I nodded, not trusting my voice. He stood slowly, came around his desk. Leaned against it, looking down at me. Do you understand what you're suggesting? I did. God help me, I did. And I didn't care. Or maybe I cared too much. About staying in school. About making my parents proud. About the way he was looking at me. Yes, I said. And sealed my fate with that one word. He reached out, touched my cheek. His hand warm and steady. This has to stay between us, he said. No one can ever know. I nodded again, my skin tingling where he touched me. Come back tonight, he said. After your last class. We'll discuss the details then. I left his office in a daze. Floating through the rest of my classes. Not really hearing anything. Just feeling his touch on my cheek. Just counting the hours until night fell. Just wondering what I've gotten myself into. And trying not to think about how much I wanted it. The campus was different after dark. Empty halls echoing with my footsteps. Shadows stretching long and deep. His office light was the only one burning. Like a beacon guiding me home. Or leading me astray. I knocked softly, my hand trembling. Enter, he called. And I did. Crossed that threshold. Knowing everything would change. He was standing by the window. Silhouetted against the city lights. Lock the door, he said. The click seemed to echo in the quiet room. Final. Definitive. No going back. He turned to face me then. And I saw something in his eyes. Something that made my breath catch. Something that made me forget about grades. About money. About everything except this moment. Are you sure about this, Ellie? His voice was rough, almost strained. I took a step toward him. Then another. Until we were breathing the same air. Yes, I said. And reached for him. That first kiss was like diving into deep water. Drowning and breathing all at once. His hands in my hair. My fingers clutching his shirt. Everything I thought I knew disappeared. Replaced by sensation. By need. By him. Later, much later. We straightened our clothes. Fixed our hair. Tried to look normal. Your grades won't be a problem anymore, he said. But I barely heard him. I was already addicted to something else. Something far more dangerous than academic success. I was falling for Thomas Bennett. And I had no idea how far I would fall. Or how hard the landing would be. The next few weeks passed in a blur of lectures and secret meetings. I told myself it was just about the grades. Just about staying in school. But I was lying to myself. Every time I saw him in class, my heart would race. The way he moved across the lecture hall. How his voice changed when he read poetry. The secret glances we shared when no one was looking. It was becoming an obsession. I started dressing differently. Spending money I didn't have on nicer clothes. Wearing makeup to early morning classes. Anything to catch his eye. Our meetings became more frequent. Not just about maintaining my grades anymore. We'd talk for hours in his office. About literature, art, life. He told me about his travels through Europe. About the books he'd written. About his dreams of retiring to a cottage in Maine. I soaked up every word. Desperate to know more about him. To understand what made him tick. You're different from the others, he'd say. You understand things on a deeper level. And I'd glow under his praise. Forget about the wrongness of it all. Forget about the age difference. Forget about everything except how he made me feel. One night, he took me to dinner. A small Italian place an hour from campus. Where no one would recognize us. He ordered wine I couldn't pronounce. Taught me about proper table settings. Made me feel sophisticated, grown up. You're blooming, he said, watching me over candlelight. Like a flower turning toward the sun. I should have seen the warning signs. The way he controlled everything. Where we met, what we discussed. How I should dress, how I should act. But I was too far gone. Too caught up in the romance of it all. My grades improved across all subjects. Not just in his class. As if his attention had given me confidence. Made me believe in myself. My roommate noticed the change in me. You seem different, she said one morning. Happier. More confident. If only she knew the reason why. The secret meetings continued. Each one more intense than the last. His office became our private world. Where rules didn't exist. Where age was just a number. Where right and wrong blurred together. But reality had a way of intruding. Like when I'd see him in faculty meetings. Walking with other professors. Looking so proper, so professional. Or when I'd hear students gossip about him. About his brilliant lectures. About his perfect marriage that ended years ago. About the rumors of other students. Other girls before me. I tried not to listen. Tried not to care. But doubt started creeping in. Was I special? Or just the latest in a line? One evening, everything changed. I was waiting in his office as usual. When I heard voices in the hallway. The dean and another professor. Walking past, discussing budget cuts. My heart nearly stopped. Thomas appeared moments later. Looking shaken, angry. We need to be more careful, he said. This is getting dangerous. I reached for him, but he stepped back. Not tonight, Ellie. We need to think about what we're doing. Those words sent ice through my veins. What do you mean? This arrangement, he said carefully. It's becoming complicated. Isn't that good? I asked. That it means something? He looked at me then, really looked at me. And I saw something that scared me. Pity. "You're young," he said softly. "You don't understand what's at stake." "I understand how I feel," I insisted. But he was already shaking his head. "Feelings make this messy. Dangerous. We need to stick to our original agreement." Original agreement. The words hit me like a slap, reminding me what this really was. A transaction. Nothing more. I left his office that night with tears in my eyes. But I came back the next week. And the week after that. Because by then, I was addicted. To his touch, his praise, his attention. Even if it wasn't real. Even if it was just pretend. I needed it like air. The campus started buzzing with rumors. Whispers about the way he looked at me in class. How often I visited his office. My suddenly improved grades. I tried to ignore them. Tried to act normal. But paranoia set in. Every glance felt accusing. Every whisper seemed about us. Thomas became more distant in public. Barely acknowledging me in class. Our meetings grew shorter, more businesslike. The warmth in his eyes turning cold. I was losing him. And I didn't know how to stop it. One night, I broke down in his office. "I love you," I said. The words spilling out like blood from a wound. He froze, hands suspended over his papers. The silence stretched between us. Thick and heavy with unspoken things. "No," he said finally. "You don't. You can't." But I did. God help me, I did. Even knowing it was wrong. Even knowing it would end badly. I loved him. And that's when everything started to fall apart. The next morning, there was an email in my inbox. From the dean's office. Requesting a meeting to discuss my academic situation. My hands shook as I read it. Someone knew. Someone had reported us. I tried to reach Thomas, but he wasn't in his office. Wasn't answering his phone. Wasn't anywhere I could find him. The dean's office was on the top floor. All polished wood and quiet authority. I sat in the waiting room, heart pounding. Watching the secretary type endlessly. Finally, the door opened. "Ms. Parker, please come in." Dean Roberts was a small woman with steel gray hair. And eyes that seemed to see right through me. "We've received some concerning information," she began. My mouth went dry. "About your sudden academic improvement." She shuffled through some papers on her desk. Particularly in Professor Bennett's class. I tried to keep my face neutral. Tried to breathe normally. "Is there anything you'd like to tell me?" Yes, I wanted to scream. I'm in love with him. He's in love with me. It's not what you think. Instead, I shook my head. "No, ma'am. I've just been working harder." She watched me for a long moment. Like she was waiting for me to crack. "Very well," she said finally. "But we'll be monitoring the situation." I practically ran from her office. Straight to Thomas's classroom. He was there, preparing for his next lecture. Looking perfectly composed. Until he saw my face. "What's wrong?" he asked. But his voice was different. Colder. More professor than lover. I told him about the dean's meeting. Watched his face grow pale. "This has to end," he said. Just like that. For words to destroy my world. "What?" "No, we can be careful, Dash. It's over, Ellie." His voice was firm. Final. But I love you, I whispered. He laughed then. A harsh, bitter sound. No, you don't. You love the idea of me. The fantasy we created. But it's not real. It never was. Each word was like a knife, cutting away my illusions. What about everything you said? Everything we shared? He straightened his tie. A nervous gesture I once found endearing. I helped you pass your classes. You gave me what I wanted. That was our arrangement. Nothing more. I felt sick. Physically ill. You're lying, I said. I know you felt something. He looked at me then. Really looked at me. And I saw nothing of the man I loved. You're very young, Ellie. You'll get over this. Find someone your own age. Live your life. I wanted to scream. To throw things. To make him feel as broke. And as I did. Instead, I just stood there. Watching him gather his papers. Goodbye, Ellie. He walked out without looking back. Leaving me alone in the empty classroom. With my shattered heart. The next few weeks were a blur. I stopped going to his class. Stopped eating. Stopped caring about anything. My other grades started slipping again. But this time, no one was there to save me. The whispers continued. But now they were tinged with pity. Poor Ellie Parker. Another victim of Professor Bennett's charm. I heard he'd done this before. With other students. Other young girls who thought they were special. Who thought they were different. The truth hit me like waves. Each revelation worse than the last. I wasn't special. I wasn't different. I was just another fool. Another notch in his academic belt. The semester ended. I barely passed my classes. Moved to a different apartment. Changed my major to avoid his department. But I couldn't avoid him completely. Would see him sometimes on campus. Looking exactly the same. While I felt completely different. Broken. Changed. Older in ways that had nothing to do with age. One day, months later, I saw him with another student. She was young, pretty. Looking at him the way I used to. And I finally understood. This was his pattern. His addiction. Not to love, but to power. To control. To making young girls feel special. Then breaking them when he was done. I wanted to warn her. To save her from what I went through. But I knew she wouldn't listen. Just like I wouldn't have listened. Some lessons you have to learn the hard way. Some scars you have to earn yourself. That night, I wrote him a letter. Poured out everything I felt. All the pain, all the anger. All the love that turned to hate. Then I burned it. Watched the ashes float away. Like my innocence. Like my illusions. Like the girl I used to be. I graduated 2 years later. Saw him at the ceremony. He nodded politely, nothing more. Like we were strangers. Like he hadn't once known every inch of my soul. And maybe he never did. Maybe that was the biggest lie of all. I moved to New York after graduation. Started a new life. Met someone my own age. Someone who loves me for who I am. Not for who he can make me be. Sometimes I think about that girl. The one who walked into his classroom. So naive, so eager to please. So ready to believe in fairy tales. She's gone now. replaced by someone stronger, someone wiser, someone who knows that love shouldn't cost you your soul. That's the real lesson I learned. Not from his lectures about poetry, but from the way he broke my heart. Some spaces between words are meant to stay empty. Some stories are better left untold. Some loves are just lessons in disguise. End.